we'll go ahead and get started. And I'll start with my own story because I'm a person who took the journey from client to intern to practitioner. And that way, if people come later, they won't miss the videos of the child we're going to highlight tonight. But in 2006, I was very anxious, very confused, very depressed. In fact, the problem had been developing for like 4 years at that point. Like in 2003, when my daughter was 3 years old, and she could put together a 12-piece puzzle, but if she left one disassembled on the floor, and I, as the mom, wanted to pick it up, put it together, and put it away, I recognized I was unable to assemble a 12-piece puzzle. And I was a woman who had built my own house. I had been a top math student in my high school, and now I couldn't even put a 12-piece puzzle together. I had no clue why. It was a long journey to figure out why. So by 2006, I had been on antidepressants. I had been on mood-stabilizing medication. I had, gone on to thyroid. Before those things, I had tried things like St. John's wort and SAMI, and so I tried all kinds of things and sought out counseling and everything you're supposed to do. But I was just getting worse. So I learned about neurofeedback by reading the book Healing Anxiety and Depression by Dr. Daniel Amen. And he's the world's foremost authority at looking at mental health problems with respect to brain scans that show, those are brain scans that show activity levels in different areas of the brain. So he had learned neurofeedback when he was a psychiatrist in the military. And that had been what led him into becoming into the forefront of neuroscience in terms of brain imaging, because he'd become very interested in learning about what's happening inside the brain and how do we impact it. So I read his book, and it really helped me understand what was occurring with me, and it led me back to likelihood that there was a toxicity factor in underlying my illness, because he had outlined 7 different types of anxiety and depression, and I didn't really fit the criteria in his book for bipolar, which is the diagnosis, but I really fit in the category that could be caused by toxic exposure. And it ended up being toxic mold that had caused brain damage. And when I went to work with a doctor with that specialty, he did an MRI in my brain and it showed numerous lesions throughout the white matter of my brain. So that explains why I had lost so much cognitive ability. My teenage daughter had to take over running the home. Even though I'd become too disabled to work, I had to send my preschooler to daycare. Even though my original career was in child care, I'd parented 6 kids, but now I couldn't even parent my one extraordinarily cooperative child. I had my last child was just the easiest child in the world could imagine, but I was this woman who was so totally overwhelmed I couldn't parent the best child that you could possibly be trying to raise. So I was just overwhelmed. I was losing my ability to drive. I knew I shouldn't be on the roads. I was very careful about where I drove. But I heard about neurofeedback. In fact, I was at a Natur-Tyme event. I saw in the Natur-Tyme newsletter there was a biofeedback day at the store. So I went to the store, and I met my coworker, mentor, Barry Bates, who will be here as soon as the traffic allows him to get here. So I came as a severely dysregulated client. And it's kind of ironic because I happen to be a very treatment-resistant client. So it's kind of ironic that his most treatment-resistant client is the one who hung around and became completely fascinated and never left. But in February 2007, I transitioned from training in the office to home training, because at that point it was my brain damage had been documented as very widespread, and so it was obviously a real severe condition. It was going to take more than 40 sessions of neurofeedback, and for those with the most severe conditions, we can set them up with home training. So if someone with severe autism, once we document that they're responding well to neurofeedback, we can teach a parent how to do it and set them up with equipment at home, and that way they can do the more extensive training that's required for the most severe conditions. So I became a home training client, and by May of 2007, I finally began to make progress. And I became completely captivated, and I asked my mentor, Barry Bates, could I can I be your apprentice? Will you teach me everything you know? So I interned with him for 18 months, and I took an introductory course and an advanced course in neurofeedback through the EEG Institute. And once I was ready, I asked, how can I be your coworker? So I have been at Syracuse Neurofeedback as an intern or practitioner role since 2007. And it was a long journey. It took hundreds of sessions for me, whereas the average client needs 40. But I'm now at a high level of functioning, and I've been off meds for about 4 or 5 years now. So you can get there. No matter, and the number of layers in my condition ended up being huge, because the toxicity was a factor, and we ended up uncovering some repressed childhood abuse in my background I didn't even know was there, that we had to work through. And so it was a long journey, and then the widespread brain damage. And this is Tricia George, who works here at Natur-Tyme. And September 30th of last year, I began working with her daughter. Why don't you take it over now? See, we have a second mic. And I'll put on the videos whenever you're ready for those. If you come in here, you'll be on the YouTube video.
I've worked here for like 6 years, and I've always tried to do everything like natural and talking to the vitamin staff that we have. And my daughter has started showing signs of ADHD and sensory issues, and just being, I thought, a little more problematic than the average child. So she was diagnosed with ADHD from her pediatrician, and I had came in and talked to the vitamin staff about natural ways to, do it with diet and, focusing her on doing something else like dance we started out with. And then between the school and the doctor, I was pressured and pressured and pressured over about the course of two years before I caved and started her on ADHD meds. So they really do, they pressure you, and they try to put everybody in a box. And she's on the tinier end. She's very petite, and the biggest side effect was loss of appetite and insomnia. So, of course, when I first started her out on it, she would eat even less. She was up at midnight, and I, when I had brought my concern to the doctor, oh, let's switch her, let's up it, let's do this, and I'm just, I went with it for about the second grade, entire second grade. And I just did not notice any pros. I just saw cons, and I had decided to just stop, because every time I would call the doctor, their answer was to switch her or up it, and I'm just like, you know what, I'm just not going to switch her anymore. So I stopped, and I had seen these booklets here at Natur-Tyme, and I really wasn't sure like what it was really about, if they could help her, and then I just kind of like forgot about it. And then my mom called me and said, I picked up this booklet at Natur-Tyme, and I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm like, oh, that's the same one that I noticed. And she's like, well, I'm going to call and I'm going to see. And she had called me. Yeah, I talked to them. They said that they can help. Okay, so I called and I talked to Priscilla for a good long while, and she told me some stories. So we had started her out there, and she's slower progressor, but I wouldn't trade it for like anything in the world. No, magic drug is gonna, take the place of what I got from bringing her to neuroscience. So on a whim, because I would talk hear about how horrible she was in the morning and how it would take me like an hour. And I don't understand. Just tell her to put clothes on. Just tell her to listen. You're not disciplining her enough. And I'm like, no, I don't think you understand. So I had taped her one morning, you know, and I had brought the video in, and they were like, oh my God, I can't believe it. So not that, maybe a few months ago, I had taped her, you know, her morning routine, and I showed her, and she was like, wow, this is fantastic, you know, I'd love to show this so, you know, people can actually see how she's progressed. And now I get up, and you know, sometimes she wakes me up. Sometimes she's like, hey, did you do this? You know, and I'm just amazed, you know, and she still goes. She still has some other, she's got a few things that we have been working on with her. So we have noticed significant improvement, and, you know, she's been great. And the before video isn't even the worst. This was her behaving because I was taping her. So, I don't know. She's 8 years old.
Since last September 30th. So she's gone.
Almost a year.
I think she's come for about 45 sessions now. So she's one who's going to need a little more than average kid. She responded a little slower than average, but we saw slow, steady gains right from the beginning. Yeah, grab the lights.
Let's go, please.
I don't want this.
Let's go.
No.
I have to make you lunch. Can we please get downstairs?
No.
Come on.
I don't want this.
Come on.
I don't want this.
Come on.
No.
Come on.
No.
Peyton, come on.
I don't want this.
You got to come downstairs. Come on. Come on.
I don't want this.
Peyton, come on.
I don't want this. I don't want this.
Come on, let's go downstairs.
No.
Come on.
No.
You already changed your outfit for 10 minutes.
I don't want this.
Let's go, please.
I don't want this.
Let's go.
No.
I have to make you lunch. Can we please get downstairs?
No.
Come on.
I don't want this.
Come on.
I don't want this.
Come on.
No.
Come on.
No.
Peyton, come on.
Oh, yeah. This was probably like 20 minutes after. All right,
We've got one more before video.
Stop! Leave me alone.
Put your sneakers on.
Right here.
Without making a knot in them. Let me see.
I'm taking out the knot.
Okay, can you put them on?
I don't like jeans.
Can you put them on, please?
I don't like jeans.
Come on, they're not jeans.
Yes, they are.
Come on.
Yes, they are. Stop! Leave me alone.
Put your sneakers on.
Right here.
Without making a knot in them. Let me see.
I'm taking out the knot.
Okay, can you put them on?
I'm going to have one more, and that's it.
Yeah.
So now what do we do?
Getting ready for school in the morning.
Go downstairs. Feed the dog.
Feed the dog. Come on, go.
Come on, Sam.
Thank you. Do you have everything you need in your bag? Do you have everything you need in your bag?
Don't have my water bottle.
Okay, so just your water bottle?
Yeah.
Do you need that book for tomorrow or not yet? For Monday?
Tuesday.
Tuesday? Okay, so we're all set. And you're ready to rock and roll? You're going to put your sneakers in?
Yep. Yeah.
So now what do we do?
Go downstairs.
Can you see that better with the lights off? Is that better? Okay. Okay, so you have any more questions for Tricia on this girl and her progress?
All the time, every day, getting ready to go to the park, getting ready to go to bed, getting ready to go to my mother's house, getting ready to go out to dinner, getting ready for something that she was looking forward to. It was always, her clothes, her shoes, the socks, just not being able to focus on getting ready, And, I can watch the video and kind of laugh about it now, but when you deal with that times 5 every morning, 3 times a day, it was just like, oh my God, how am I going to get through life? And now, and now it was really difficult for me to tape her being good because I didn't need to tell her anything to do. She just gets ready, she feeds the dog on her own, she goes downstairs and she picks out what she wants for breakfast, she helps me put it together, especially now, she helps me remember what I need to bring with me. Oh, don't forget your water bottle, and don't forget this, and oh yeah, oh, well, did you need something for school? Oh, yep, I have it all ready, and she's great. I never told them that I was taking her off the meds. So, so I called about a month after I had stopped the beginning of 3rd grade, and I had just, oh, hey, how's she doing, and they were like, oh, wow, she's really great, and I'm just, thinking to myself, yeah, she's not on meds, so, and I had told her resource teacher about the neuroscience, and he was, yeah, we'll see how that works, and he's, seeing her progress, a steady incline, but she's got more than one, she's got a couple different issues that, we couldn't start one without kind of focusing on the other one, so we're kind of steadily inclining with her improvement, but she's been really great.
With her daughter, there's a great need of calming on the right side of the brain. The right side of the brain is the emotional side, so we really needed to spend a lot of time calming. And the attention piece, the ADHD, is typically up in the left front, but that's where we're activating, and it was a long time before we were able to bring that site in without getting her over revved. So that's one of the reasons we're continuing beyond 40 sessions, is because now we can effectively train the left side, but that's quite recent. Yeah. Being left or right-handed? If a child is left-handed, there's a slightly greater chance that their sides of their brain are swapped to function, but it's still pretty rare. But we did work on sensory integration issues. The site we trained first was a site tying the temporal and parietal lobe together, which is for sensory integration, physical and emotional calming, awareness of where you are in space and what's happening around you in space. So we put that site in right from the first session. So we can work with that on a brain level. Occupational therapy would be a nice complementary approach.
She still has with sensory. There's no. I don't think there's a diagnosis for like. There's an ADHD diagnosis, but there's no way for them to test. That's from what I was told. There's no diagnosis for sensory. So without a diagnosis, the school can't do anything. But she does have an IEP for, like, she does have the diagnosis, and she still can benefit from a little bit of resource, a little bit of one-on-one. But as far as the sensory things, I mean, I went online and looked at some things that I could do, but like as far as going to an occupational therapist, I didn't do that step. I mean, I found this.
And you know, as a result of neurofeedback, her daughter's apt to be able to make, if she does go to work with an occupational therapist, she's apt to be able to make much better use of that experience than she could have when her brain was still highly dysregulated. So it would be a great follow-up, because we haven't completely eradicated the sensory integration issues. We've improved them. They are still there.
I mean, yeah. It's very hard to push them. I will say it's very hard to. It took me a lot of phone calls to a lot of people and a lot of waiting. Wait, let's see, let's wait. And you know, I would wait a week, call them back. Okay, well, when are you going to put the testing through? You know, she does have this diagnosis. Oh, well, I'm going to have to call this person and have that person call you back, and it was quite the whirlwind, but now we're progressing, and she is improving, so.
Yeah. This is a more complicated situation than just ADHD because of all the sensory issues. But with someone who had a less complicated presentation of ADHD, we typically see complete resolution within 20 to 40 sessions, and the effects appear to last for life. And research has shown that most of the kids that undergo neurofeedback for ADHD gain 10 to 30 IQ points, where they're actually enhancing their IQ or giving them better access to the IQ they already have. We're not sure, but that doesn't matter. We'll take it. Yeah. Yes. Well, that was a research study I'm quoting. In our practice, we're not actually testing IQ. We are testing sustained attention, speed of response, impulsivity, and consistency. But the tests we have, some 6-year-olds can do it. Kids younger than 6 can't do it, and almost every 7-year-old can do it. So from age 7 up, we're consistently doing that computerized testing. Do you have a better answer? This is Barry Bates. He's my coworker, mentor. He's the reason I'm able to be here as a competent professional today. So go ahead.
The testing that we have, as Priscilla stated, at 3 years old, they're not going to be able to do that objective testing. So we have to rely on symptom-based reports, unfortunately. But later on, 6 and 7, they can reliably do the testing. They do IQ tests at that young an age, but they're not as reliable as when they're older. Right now, we're going to move to the training portion, where young lady up. She did this noontime, so you get 2 sessions today.
You might as well do T3, T4 this one.
All right. And so we'll be walking through the setup.
So, Tricia, you didn't yet address your own neurofeedback training. Why don't you talk about that briefly?
When I had brought Peyton in, I had also been having like really bad migraines, and I had prescriptions for them, and they work, but you know, maybe like they took 80% away, and they were quite frequent. So I had talked to her about the migraines, and also I have always been super outgoing and never had any issues with anxiety my entire life. And then about a year and a half ago, I just started getting like panic attacks, and I don't know why. I still don't know why. And the doctors couldn't give me a reason, and I couldn't explain why I was feeling that way. They couldn't explain why I was feeling that way. But I would come to work, and I work in the back, but I wouldn't be able to be around anybody. I would go into the back where nobody was around, just sit by myself, and I would be done. And I just knew something was not right. So once again, I was pressured by the doctors to be on medication, and I had some side effects. I mean, it was working, but I didn't like the side effects. So I had talked to him about that as well, and about we had nipped that in the bud like a couple months before I got pregnant, which I was really thankful for because I wouldn't want to be on those meds and be pregnant. So, and I haven't had a migraine since way before I was pregnant. And I think we talked a little bit about calming down, you know, because now I'm anxious, not like panic attack anxious, but anxious as my due date comes, you know, because I don't want to do it. You don't want to what? I don't want to do it, but I have to. So, you know, I'm just trying to tap into like every avenue I can to kind of just relax through that.
I don't think you've had 22 sessions.
Yeah, I mean,
so she responded quickly.
Yeah, no migraine, no. I was on a different kind of med than Peyton. ADHD med you can just stop any day with no warning. Anxiety medicine, no. I had weaned myself off that. I didn't tell my doctor what I was doing because they're gonna, oh no, let's switch. No, I didn't want to even deal with that. So I just, you know, instead of taking one a day, you know, I would like kind of like slice. And I don't recommend doing this. I just did it, you know, on my own. I don't want any. You know, I would chop off a little bit of pill, so it was like 3/4 for like a week, and then half for like a week, and then eventually I was like taking a quarter every day, and then a quarter every other day, and then a quarter every other 3 days, and then I would kind of like stop.
Did you stop meds before or during? You don't remember?
I think it was like I was definitely towards the end of weaning off when I started doing. Anxiety meds they're different for everybody. I mean, what worked for me might not even work for somebody else. So I kind of like felt it, you know, myself, what was kind of working for me, what I could push, and what I couldn't.
In general, the people who are titrating down with their medicines, if it's anxiety, most of those are on an as-needed basis, and they will find that they need them less, and they'll titrate themselves down. They have a pretty long half-life, so you can't go too fast or else you'll get into trouble. But now, typically people start noticing that the medications are working better. And then they'll get to the point where they're saying, I'm feeling as if I have too much medication. And that's the time to start titrating down. You know, always with the in coordination with the physician that prescribed it. All right, I set the sensors on. The sensors just listen to the brain waves. And they're a little electroconductive paste holds them on, and there's a cleaning solution that's literally liquid sandpaper that gives us a better connection. And then, if you change seats, the feedback is going to be in the form of a vibrating teddy bear. There will be an audible component and visual. And how were the butterflies last time? Were they okay? I'll try.
Maybe a tree going through seasons and media plant. So feedback is given both through visual cues and sound cues and the vibration. Those are all going to be in response to what her brain waves are doing. So the playback speed of how fast this tree scene goes through the seasons will be in direct response to what her brain waves are doing.
This is done at the subconscious level. So conscious thought, conscious action doesn't help it. All right. So right now, the size of the screen, the vibration, and the sound level are reward. You notice the screen size is very small right now. The first minute, the brain it doesn't know what we want it to do. So the computers are looking at the brain, and we're trying to catch it doing the brain waves that we want at random. When we see that happening randomly, we reward it. The brain likes the reward, and then we'll change function to maintain that reward. And the screen is getting larger. And the vibrating teddy bear will start vibrating. And at the subconscious level, the brain likes that reward. It's just part of the inherent capabilities of the brain. It likes that reward. And so it wants the screen to be large, it wants the music volume to be large, it wants the screen to be clear, and it will change brainwave function to do that. As it changes brainwave function, it is increasing the blood supply to that group of neurons in that whole regulatory network. It is going to be manufacturing more neurotransmitters, releasing more neurotransmitters into the synapse. We can change the set points on the receptor sites on the postsynaptic neurons so that it doesn't take as much to trigger it. And with repeat exposure, the brain will start growing more synapses if it needs to. It will actually regrow whole new neuronal pathways that had not pre-existed. Alzheimer's research demonstrated that Alzheimer's patients, after 1 year of neurofeedback once a week, they had grown whole new neuronal pathways that had not pre-existed. In traumatic brain injuries, we are regrowing brainwaves, brainwave structures. It is really impressive. I have one young man who was in a nearly fatal automobile accident when he was at age 2.5. He came away from the accident completely blind, unable to walk by himself. His left arm was completely contracted. You couldn't even lift it to do hygiene. His level of function was he sat in a chair, rocked back and forth, made guttural noises, and chewed on his left hand. He could say a few words. He came to me in December of '09, and he was in his early 20s. And his father was, this is what we have. I agreed to see what we could do. The first session, he stopped chewing his hand. He started sleeping through the night, not waking up screaming and cursing. Fast forward 3 months, and it's springtime. He's walking by himself. He's not chewing. He's not rocking all the time. He follows his father to the door of my office, and his father says, show him what you can do. He took his arm, and he could reach it out to the side, back, up. He could hug his mother. And when it progressed, that August, he was at a wedding, and he danced with the bride. And fast forward to the next spring, so a year and a quarter into it. And by this time, they're training at home. And the father called me up. He said, what protocols do you have for vision? And I said, I know we have all these miracles that are happening, but if that optic nerve is severed, I have no way to get on the end of it to rebuild that optic nerve. He says, no, you don't understand. He can see. And I was, of course, rather skeptical. And he went through a list of the things that he considered evidence of how his son could see. And all of it could be explained away until he got to the point, he said he's fascinated with a mirror. A mirror holds no value without a reflection. Okay, he can see. So I added in vision protocols. Now it's many years later. This young man walks 2.5 miles a day for exercise on the road. In bad weather, he'll push a wheelchair for stability. Incredible. He speaks complete sentences, paragraphs. Just last Christmas, the father called me and said that relatives who had seen him at Thanksgiving saw him again at Christmas and were just blown away by his increase in vocabulary and the fluidity of speech. Pretty amazing. Now, if you brought your son to me and said, turn his vision on, I wouldn't make any promises. That just happened that for him it worked. So when we start exercising that neuronal network, we don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes it's absolute miracles. Sometimes you don't get much. Fortunately, the success rate is dramatically high. So we've been going through here some of the screens here. We have raw brainwave coming in on the top, and then we have a spectral display that's showing me the relative power of the different brain waves. The more power, the higher the peak, and the lighter the color. And so it gives me, at a quick visual glance, I can see what's going on with that brain. I have one sensor above each ear. So I'm looking at the brain's ability to regulate from side to side. So I'm asking it to generate one brain wave above each ear, the exact same brain wave, and then to shift the timing between those two. So it has to regulate the waveform above each ear and then the timing between the two sites.
The reason we picked this site for Tricia, this morning we did physical and emotional calming for her because she has because of the anxiety and her tendency to need to jiggle her leg. And we did the site for emotional control because that fear of the upcoming labor helped calm that down. but she's vulnerable to panic attacks and migraines. So this site that we're doing this evening with her is the site for emotional and physiological stability. It's a site that helps migraines and panic attacks, helps keep your whole neurophysiology stable. So these are the 3 most important sites for Tricia.
And I wish I had the ability to put these screens up on the big screen for you, but we have trend lines. The graph at the bottom, I've taken that fast-moving graph, and it is sideways, slowed down, and there are trend lines reflecting different waveforms. And the way those line up tell me how that brain is responding. And this is in a classic fight-and-flight response, which would correlate with the anxiety. And by the time we were 3 minutes in, the anxiety shut off significantly, and at the same time, the brain waves for creativity and imagination went up. When your brain shifts into a fight-and-flight situation, we have specific brainwave structures for everything that we do. So when you're studying your math, there'll be a certain brainwave structure. When you are watching television, there'll be a different brainwave structure. If you are scared and you turn on that very primitive structure in the brain called the amygdala, and it triggers the fight-and-flight response, you are going to run for your life or fight for your life. The brain is going to shut down things it doesn't need. If you're going to fight for your life, you don't care if your mother loves you. So those brain waves are shut off. Creativity is shut off. Emotional access is shut off. Muscle tension is heightened. So your speed of reflex, your heart rate is going to go up. You're ready to go. It's designed to be a temporary state. You're supposed to transition in and out of it. If you get stuck there are symptoms that correlate with that. When you are ready to go all the time, your memory is shut off. Some of your bowel function is shut off. A lot of things are shut off. So when people go through a panic attack or an anxiety attack, they will often have diarrhea or constipation. They will say, "Oh, I'm forgetting everything. I'm so stressed. I can't remember things." Because brain has shut those off because we're supposed to be running or fighting for our life. But we're living normal every day in this brainwave pattern. And so we can watch over time, we can watch that brain shut off those brainwave patterns and go back to a more normal pattern. So what would cause someone's brain to get stuck in that? Repeat exposure. Type A personality would do that. What happens is the brain uses this fight and flight response for a lot of things. For example, let's say, I'll go personal experience. 1990-ish, my grandfather died. I was very close to my grandfather. Well, when you get the phone call, you can't just go curl up in a corner and cry. You have to do things. You have a funeral to attend to. You have, logistical things. How do you feed the family? Where does the family stay? All those things that have to happen. So how does the brain do that? It uses the fight and flight response, because the fight and flight response is going to push down emotional access. So grief is going to be suppressed. You're not going to be sleeping well, but you're not going to be tormented by the grief. So it's designed to be temporary, so that after you do all the stuff, when you're in an emotionally safe place and a physically safe place, you can lower your arousal level and you can start processing that grief. And initially, the memory of my grandfather is going to be completely encapsulated with the grief of the loss. And in a normal, healthy brain, it takes approximately 12 months for the brain to separate out the memories of my grandfather from the grief of the loss. it'll store it in physically separate places in the brain. And so a year later, I should be able to remember all the fishing trips, all the good things, without the grief. But what happens if you don't have a physically safe place or an emotionally safe place simultaneously, so you can lower that arousal level and transition? What if you're a soldier on the battlefield? What if you're living in an environment that's not physically and emotionally safe, or perceived not to be safe? Perception is everything. The brain stays in that fight and flight response and gets stuck, because that's now its normal mode of operation with all the symptoms. So the anxiety, the fear, the muscle tension, the muscle aches, the memory problems, it's all because you're in the wrong brainwave pattern for the function you're trying to accomplish. Without a doubt, our brains are designed to accommodate and adjust, but our lifestyle doesn't facilitate that. Remember, I spoke of the brain separating the emotional grief from the memories. That happens in stage 1 sleep. Stage 1 sleep is when you are just coasting off, and before you lose awareness, you reach this really comfy place. Sometimes your hearing is really acute, but the sounds are distant and echoey. And then you lose awareness and drift off. That is stage 1. You can get stage 1 sleep in the mornings. If you have, say it's a weekend morning, you have no responsibilities, there's no one, you can just slowly wake up and toss and turn and drift in and out, you can get stage 1 there. But in our society, we don't get that in the mornings. There's an alarm clock, there's children, there's dogs, there's something that wakes us up. And it doesn't matter, you can be in deep REM sleep, you're up, and you don't get stage 1 in the morning. Well, at nighttime, do we get stage 1? Well, if you're anxious or if you're stressed and you put your head on the pillow and it takes 3 hours to fall asleep, well, we're not going to get much in the way of stage 1 sleep, because we want to fall asleep quickly. So we are going to address it some way. We're going to exhaust ourselves so that when we've hit the pillow, we're out. Well, when you're that exhausted, you blast right through stage 1 and you go into a deeper stage of sleep. Or we'll self-medicate. We'll take some sleepy time tea or a glass of wine. We'll do something, or we'll take Xanax or Ambien, or we'll take something that will help us fall asleep. All of that robs us of stage 1 sleep. And so that resolution of trauma is slowed down or stopped. And the subconscious mind is continually wanting to get that trauma resolved, and it switches you to the brainwave structure of living in that trauma. And you get stuck. So we work at unsticking you, getting the brain, the ability of the brain to transition from state to state seamlessly. So a child sitting down to do his homework can transition to other things quickly and easily. But these lower frequency brain waves have a lot of power, a lot of energy in them. And they're hard to just shut right down. So if you have someone sitting and watching television, their brain waves shift to look just like an ADD child. When you're sitting and watching, television is training children to be ADD. The brain wave structure when you're sitting there is like, and you're actually using less of your brain than when you're asleep. You're more of a vegetative state watching television than you are when you're sleeping. Right. Television is designed to sell things, and they have found ways with the timing of the scene changes and the colors to shut off your brain, the higher functioning of your brain, transitions to a lower function so that the advertising goes directly to your subconscious mind. It works. It works very well. The problem is that we deal with the effects of it. So your husband is watching TV and with the kids on either side, and it's dinner time, and you come in and you say, dinner time, up, let's go. You're going to get a negative response. But because they're in these very slow brain waves that have a lot of power, they're hard to transition out of. You get an easier response if you go 10 minutes early and say, hey, in 10 minutes, we got to have lunch. 5 minutes now, down count. Then it gives them time to transition out of that state so that they can function. And that way, when you say, oh, it's dinner time, ring the dinner bell, you're less likely to get a negative response. Yes. The video games, yes, they transition you right into that same hypnotic state.
But they're more addictive.
Yes.
Because they're raising dopamine levels. And the kids will be drawn, especially the violent, fast action ones. And so they'll be drawn back to get that next fix. They're less passive. There's some advantages to being less passive.
Ah, nice. The anxiety has shut off. It is way, way down. Very nice. You feeling pretty comfy?
I am.
Good, good. And so we track the brainwave structure to see how that brain is shifting states. And you can tell an awful lot from these lines because as you mature, your brain function changes. The brain waves of a 4-year-old are different from the brain waves of a 20-year-old, and they transition to that new state. But what happens if something traumatic happens to a child at 7? Now I'm looking at a 40-year-old person, and I see a 7-year-old's brainwaves. Because if you are exposed to an emotional trauma, a chemical trauma, or a physical trauma, your brain stores and processes that trauma in the brain waves that it has. So if I'm 7 years old and I get exposed to a trauma, I'm exposed to a trauma, I'm going to use brainwave pattern. Well, now my brain has learned when I'm exposed to a trauma, I'm going to store it in this pattern. So even if I'm 30, I'm going to still use that same brainwave pattern. And so if I go in here and I see a 7-year-old brainwave, asking, what 7?
And that happened to me in my very first session with Barry as a client. He asked me about childhood trauma. And I said there was no history of childhood trauma, because as far as I knew, there wasn't. I came back a week later and said the only thing I could think of in terms of trauma is there was an incident in first grade where I playfully stuck out my tongue and was harshly criticized by the teacher. And I agonized night after night about that. So he said, well, that's trauma. That's how you responded to that, and that's trauma. But I thought, how could something like that in first grade still be affecting my brainwaves now in my mid-40s, or that I was at that point? But he took that as legitimate. But later on, we uncovered deeper layers of trauma that I had completely repressed. I didn't know was there. But he could tell the very first time I came up in and got hooked up that there was a trauma background. So, and it was a challenging process, but I found that there was a certain amount of wisdom to the neurofeedback. What we're doing today is called awake state training with Tricia. We're working with the cortex of the brain. But the trauma resolution type of training we do is called deep state. And you're in a recliner, eyes closed, earphones on, teddy bear in your arms. And we're guiding the brain to that stage 1 sleep, that spot in between awake and sleep. And in that spot, the first part of the brain to go to sleep is the amygdala. So the amygdala is quiet, which allows the subconscious mind to present to the conscious mind traumatic material, but to present it while you're in a witness state. So, you might perceive what the emotions were. You're not entangled in them. You're more like witnessing them. So it was a fascinating experience for me. And for me, when we began doing the deep state training, what I was working on the first 35 sessions worth of deep state training, again, I needed so much more than almost any of our clients. The first 35 sessions, I was working on the trauma of having become mentally ill as an adult and how ashamed I felt, like as a mother. I had been a super parent with my first daughter, and then with my younger daughter, luckily she was an easygoing kid that was very resilient. But I had been mentally ill more than half her life at that point. So I felt a sense of guilt. I felt a sense of guilt toward my 4 stepchildren because here they'd lost their first mother to depression, and she had kind of abandoned them, and now here I'd taken the role of mom, and what was happening to me, the same thing. I was overwhelmed and depressed. So I felt guilty. So the first 35 sessions, I was working on that, just the trauma of having become mentally ill as an adult. But then I got that stuff worked through, and then it went to the deeper layer, and it showed me what happened in my childhood. And it was the most fascinating experience of my life, but also, yes, very challenging. But by that point, I'd actually done more than 100 sessions of awake state training, and so my nervous system had gotten to a calm enough, stable enough place to be able to reveal that, and I was ready to handle it. And I had a close relationship with Barry as a practitioner. I had a close relationship with my psychotherapist. I had a close relationship with my physical therapist. I wasn't getting the support I needed from my husband, so all those therapists were really important. I don't think the deep state would have ended up showing me what happened to me as a child if I hadn't had those successfully established relationships with those therapists who were going to support me, and they all supported me beautifully. Mm-hmm.
I've never had that happen, fortunately. The question was, has anyone ever done the deep state and relived traumas that they couldn't deal with? We don't go directly to the deep state. We do awake state first, get the brain ready to process those emotions. And there are specific sites on the brain that I do in order to facilitate that. For example, in the right rear part of the brain is the mind-body connection, the ability to relax and calm down. Then the right prefrontal lobe is emotional regulation, rate and magnitude of emotional response. How fast is that emotion coming in? How big is it going to get? And how quickly can I recover? And then on the left, when we tie the right temporal lobe to the left prefrontal lobe, that starts calming down that to-do list. That constant stream of thoughts in your head, or the to-do list, or the voice that beats you up. This site just calms that down. But only if it has a pocket to put it in. Or if I'm asking you to put your worries and concerns, the nagging thoughts, on the back burner, and there's no back burner to put it on, that's just going to cause more stress. So I make the back burner first, and then the brain has a place to put it. It takes about 6 to 10 sessions of the awake state before people are ready for the deep state. And then we can start addressing that emotional trauma. Now, most people don't remember. They do the deep state, and they say, I had a few little dreams or whatever, but nothing major, and it's just miraculous that it's wiped clean. There are some people who are actually able to go back and relive specific things, and most of them really enjoy it. And that was one of the things. They can be good, they can be trauma, and the things that you remember are often the brain is protecting you from the actual trauma, so it's showing you something else that has a similar emotional content. And then we can track by your dreams. If you're remembering your dreams, that can tell a story.
In my own case, when it was really showing me it wasn't showing me visually what happened in childhood. It always protected me from the actual visual memories. But it was showing me what happened in childhood. And the funny thing is, after a deep state session, I would always come out with a bemused smile on my face. And like I said, I'd been a very treatment-resistant client, and it really, I didn't make any steady gains until it revealed to me what had happened in childhood. And as soon as it began to reveal to me what had happened in childhood, I began to make steady gains. So even though it was psychologically challenging, I needed a lot of psychological support during that period of time, but that's when I began to function so much better, as soon as I was able to acknowledge what happened in childhood.
Because
yes. But it was great to have not just a psychotherapy type view, but to have Barry's understanding of how the nervous system works and how my nervous system had been impacted really helped me lift some of the self-judgment off myself. You know, that it's not my fault that I became so dysregulated. This is how nervous systems respond to the kind of challenge I faced. And it really lifted a lot of my self-judgment off of me by understanding how and why I've become the way I've become.
And when the brain is not processing that emotional content, small things don't get processed. So your spouse squeezing the toothpaste tube at the wrong end or whatever, which is a minor thing, should get processed easily, and all of a sudden it's not being processed. And the subconscious brain, it wants this stuff processed, and it's the conscious mind that processes it. So, something makes me angry, a small thing. The subconscious brain goes, anger. All you memories that haven't been processed yet that contain anger, let's all go now. The door is open. And so the door might be open just a little crack, but it's going to shove all of those subconscious memories dealing with anger out. And so the individual gets this huge feeling of anger. Small trigger, big feeling. And you're like, wow, where'd that come from? The people around you might be, woo, where'd that come from? That is the underpinnings of PTSD. That unresolved trauma trying to get out. Any avenue, anytime that door is cracked, the subconscious throws it all out there. And it doesn't matter what emotion it is. It can be fear. It can be, anger. It can be whatever. It's trying to get it processed. And it doesn't do it a little drip at a time. It says, here goes the whole bucket load. That would be a reasonable assumption. And so what happens is we start dealing with the awake state of the brain, get the brain ready to process those emotions, give them the deep state, let it get processed, and their world changes. You have people. I have a man, he came to me, he had a young daughter, like 4 years old, and he had another one that had just been born, and he had a rage problem. A slightest trigger, and he's breaking things. He bumped his head on the rear of his Jeep, and he broke the rear hatch on his Jeep. He used to love fixing his cars. Now he couldn't even bother because if he scraped his knuckle, he'd have this explosion of rage. And he was really concerned about what impact that would have on his children. So he came, and it just settled right down, and he came to me, and he said, I'm hoping that my daughter never remembers me with the explosive rage. I'm hoping she'll only remember me as I am now. Yeah. We did the neurofeedback. It just shut off that rage. He was not going to a therapist at that time. He had been in the past unsuccessfully because he just couldn't handle it.
It would be good to talk a little bit about the interrelationship between neurofeedback and psychotherapy. Like, I was started with a counselor before I came to neurofeedback, and I really wasn't able to make very good use of the psychotherapy while my nervous system was still so overwrought. Sometimes, especially if it was marital therapy, it would just spin me up more. And but once I was getting the neurofeedback and my system was calming down, I was able to make much more productive use of the psychotherapy. And there are more and more psychotherapists incorporating neurofeedback into their practice, and they often find neurofeedback as the place to begin and work out the specific psychological issues after the nervous system's calm and stable instead of before.
And that works with addictions also. I had a man who had been dry from alcohol for 15 years. But he said, every day I want to drink. This guy went to AA every day for 15 years. And he was losing his third marriage because the rage, the internal emotional discomfort was so large, he couldn't handle much of anything. We calmed all that down, and he said, wow, for the first time in my life, I don't want to drink. He says, all that stuff that I've learned in 15 years plus of therapy, I couldn't put into place because I wasn't in an emotional place to do that. He says, now I can use all that. He was able to save his marriage, save his business, and he's doing very well.
So we want to turn it over to you now in terms of the specific concerns you came with. If you have questions, this is going to focus more on children. We really ended up focusing quite a bit on trauma.
And I'm going to have you speak into the microphone because they are recording this so that people who weren't here.
And maybe I'll turn on the lights. I don't know if it'll record better with the lights on.
Any questions?
My concern is with regard to working with really small children. I work with kids that are 18 months to 3, and the parents, quite frankly, don't have a lot of money. So in a particular case, like with your daughter, once a child reaches the age of 3, there's funding available through the district that they go to school in. But when they're very, very young, I can already see, that this is something that I want to promote, but how are parents going to pay for it?
Insurances in New York State currently are not happy to cover neurofeedback. And so right now it's all private pay. There have been a few places that have given grants for to cover part of it. I don't, off the top of my head, don't remember the names of them. But youngsters,
Transitional living services for autism.
The youngest I have trained was 6 months. The oldest was 94. And at 6 months old, you have to have a pretty significant symptom for it to be recognized at 6 months. And that happened to be a seizure disorder. And we were able to shut down the seizures. But when you look, the young ones, if you're seeing symptoms at 18 months, 2 years old, they're pretty significant symptoms for them to be picked up. I went to a seminar a few years ago that was teaching us to recognize the symptoms of autism as young as 6 months and 12 months. In theory, at that time, the current theory was you couldn't diagnose it until 2 years old. But they showed us very specific behaviors and play behaviors that were characteristic. So the young ones, they're not as hard as you might think. They will sit there and they will watch a video. They will get entranced very easily. Are there any other questions?
We did get a chance to go through our slides because we got talking about things. But a couple of them relate to what we're talking about now. So first I wanted to show you this one that as of October 2012, the organization that advises the American Academy of Pediatrics, practice-wise, they look at all the research and then they tell the American Academy of Pediatrics what is evidence-based, what they should advocate. And they came out in 2012 saying that biofeedback is the one best support intervention for attention and hyperactivity disorders. So this is the first time that a major medical organization has clearly recognized the effectiveness of our work. And so I'm hoping that with time that will lay the groundwork for health insurance in the future. But it took chiropractic 40 years to win health insurance coverage. And this is kind of goes over the evolution of what neurofeedback, what kind of conditions we can help people with. Neurofeedback was actually started by NASA. It was discovered by NASA. They were back in the 1970s. They were looking for how to protect astronauts from rocket fuel exposure, and as part of the research, they were studying cats that they were exposing to rocket fuel. And this rocket fuel can cause seizures, neurological damage, death. And so that was happening to all these different research cats coming through. And then a group of cats came through and didn't have any seizures. Yeah, they got sick, but none of them died. None of them had seizures. They were just moderately sick. What's different about this group of cats? They went back in the research history of this research cats and found 2 years before they'd been taught to control sensory motor rhythm brain waves 2 years prior, and that had ended up making them seizure resistant. And the researcher didn't even know if humans had the same kind of brain wave, but he had an assistant with epilepsy who hooked her up. Yep, humans had the same kind of brain wave. He taught her how to produce more sensory motor rhythm. She became seizure-free. So NASA said, oh, this is great for our astronauts. We can train them for seizure resistance and for peak of performance and tension and flying, tolerating the stress of their job. And the rest of the world began treating people for seizures. But as they began treating people for seizures, they started noticing, my goodness, sleep problems are improving, dyslexia is going away, anxiety, depression are improving. So over time, more and more conditions began to be addressed with neurofeedback. And this chart is more like 6 to 8 years old. If you were to update it for today, we now also work with conditions of extreme overarousal like autism, cerebral palsy, childhood bipolar disorder. So some of those more challenging conditions, we now have developed techniques that are effective for those conditions as well.
And that was amazing research. And this was some of the stuff that convinced me, because when I first was starting to learn about neurofeedback, I was a skeptic. I went to the trainings with my wife, who is a psychiatric nurse practitioner. She's board-certified child and adolescents. I went with her to prove that this stuff could work. Came away a believer. And now, 15 years later, that's what I do for a living. So, but the evolution of this was just fascinating to me, that training astronauts and ground crew to be seizure resistant if they get exposed to rocket fuel led to being able to shut off anxiety, depression, ADD, ADHD, learning disabilities, all sorts of things. NASA's worth it, I guess. Any other questions? So what do you do when you have multiple children? Well, you can prioritize, or it is possible to lease a system and train at home. You can do it more economically that way.
The other thing is, after Barry goes home at 4:30 and I work later, so his room is vacant later in the day. And to get the cost down when there's multiple family members, what I can do late in the day is, once I've developed a protocol that someone's confidently responding well to, then I can take a second family member into the other room and go back and forth and do 2 people at once, and then I can give them a level of discount that I wouldn't be able to afford otherwise. So we did this with, Tricia would be in one room, her daughter would be another. I would go back and forth, and they got a significant discount.
And I've had families where the entire family needed it, and you would lease a system and go through that process. We had a family with Fragile X syndrome. So they had 2 children. Fragile X syndrome is the leading cause of autism. And in this case, the mother was the carrier. So the daughter, 2 X chromosomes, not as severely impacted. The son one X chromosome and mom's the donor, not a chance. And the son was 8 years old when he came, and he had some behavior issues. He did not speak. He made one sound very loudly, very frequently. He sounded like a distressed parrot, just a squawk. He knew basic sign language. He had a facilitated communication box where he could press the box and it would say things for him. The daughter was, there was a summer before she was going to go into kindergarten. In pre-K, she was getting speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, you name it, she was getting. And the daughter responded rapidly. When she went to school that fall, she was at the top of her class, even socially. She had a touch of anxiety, but that's normal for a 5-year-old girl.
She had gained 3 years of language skills in 3 months.
It
gone from being extraordinarily quiet and shy to being confident and outgoing.
So she was a miracle in a short period of time. The son, well, we slowed down his squawking, so he didn't squawk. His behavior and compliance issues settled down, but they really wanted him to speak, and that just didn't seem to turn on. There were 2 incidences over a year where the mother was absolutely convinced that her son spoke to her, but it didn't repeat itself, and no one else saw it. Well, this child loved to play baseball, and it came springtime, and he's 9 years old now. Mama used to go out on the ball field with him and coach him. But she says, he's 9, he can go out on his own, I'm going to sit in the bleachers. So he's out there playing ball, and after a couple of weeks, one of the other moms comes up to her and says, wow, what a difference in your son. We can't believe the progress he's made, particularly in speech. Now the mom was confused. She says, what do you mean speech? He doesn't speak. And the other one was like, he talks a mile a minute out there. When mom's around, Mom understands sign language. Mom has done his talking for him his entire life. He doesn't need to speak when Mom's around. But he's out there in the field by himself. He's talking a mile a minute with all the people out there. Significant consonants were missing. But speech therapy can figure that out once you know that he talks. So they were a year into it by the time they figured out he could talk.
And in that case, Grandma bought a system, because she also had a grandchild with ADHD. So the system was at Grandma's house, and 3 grandchildren were going there to get. We can...
So, not necessarily easily, but most people are able to follow the protocols that we develop. And so if I send you home with a list, say, do this 2-3 times a week, whatever, you can do it, or you can learn to do it.
So first, they usually come for 20 sessions in the office, and we establish that they are responsive and that it's worth the investment. Then we start teaching the caregiver, and so they get styrofoam head. We put stickers on the different key spots, and we write it all down for them. And then at the beginning, they might come in once a week for supervision, and once every 2 weeks, and once a month, and then once every 3 months. Ongoingly, ideally, we'd like them all to come in once every 3 months, because this is a rapidly evolving field, and we want to keep them up to date. And we want to make sure they don't forget key points, like you double the frequency when you go from the right side to the left side. We had one home trainer forget that, and then the ADD got worse. But as soon as they came in for a supervision session, we were able to straighten them out, get them back on track.
And we had the gentleman was a teacher at a school, and both of his children needed neurofeedback, and so he went to the schools, learned how to do it, and bought the equipment, and he's training his kids. He called me up and he said, it stopped working. It's making him worse. I said, well, bring all your paperwork in and we'll sit. He said, do I have to bring the children? I said, no, just bring the paperwork, the recorded sessions. I can figure it out. He had made a mistake, and he had changed the reward frequency that he was training his children at a factor of 10. When you looked on the screen, it still looked the same, but it was a factor of 10 off. Yeah, okay, that is not anywhere near the reward frequency that we had set him up to do. He just didn't recognize it. So it's important to keep that oversight to pick up on those things.
We are a little hesitant to send people home for home training because a lot of people just seem to disappear once we do that, once we give them the equipment. And we know the supervision is an important piece.
Are there any extreme negative side effects? With the model that we're using, no. The brain doesn't like to be uncomfortable. So if we're doing something that brain doesn't like, you're going to get a headache. Something is going to come in where the brain is saying, I don't like this. You're going to stop. And if the brain doesn't like something you're going to doing to it, it's not going to stay there. In the early days of neurofeedback, they didn't customize it. Everyone trained the same. And some of the side effects were headaches or anger. For the next few hours after you had a session, some people could be angry. Some people could be tearful. They could have an emotional response. It would wear off after a few hours, and in time, everyone still got better. Well, then, some people figured out, what if we customize this protocol for the individual? And they said, if we can adjust that reward frequency, those people who were experiencing anger, if you lower the reward frequency, now they're comfortable. Those people who were experiencing sadness, if you raise the reward frequency, now they're comfortable. The brain has a little sweet spot, if you will, of what it's comfortable with. If you find that, the neurofeedback is more effective, faster, and you don't get the side effects. But even in the early days, they had side effects. They just said, deal with it. You'll get better in the long run. And people did. Now, we use those side effects to narrow in on that optimal reward frequency, and that reward frequency can change over time. Headaches are very important. If someone is experiencing a headache in session, we'll be asking, what does it feel like? Where is it in the head? If the headache is a sharp pain typically toward the front of the head, the reward frequency is generally too high. If the headache is a dull, throbbing headache in the center or rear of the head, the reward frequency is generally too low. So those symptoms can lead us into the right reward frequency. Or if you come in and you say, oh man, after that last session, I was great at work. I was on top of everything, but when I went to bed, I couldn't sleep. Well, we were a little too high. And so we can adjust that. So, our variables are where we put the sensors on in the head and the reward frequency, the brainwave frequency that we are rewarding. And so we can adjust where we put them and what the frequency is to get the optimal. All right,
talk a little bit about
arousal and performance curve. All right. In a high-functioning brain, you're able to maintain your performance level regardless of your physiological arousal level. So if you're tired and dragged out, you can still think and you can still function at work. And if you're really geared up, you've had too much coffee, you can still function at work. But the brain tends to have failure modes. If you go into the over-aroused condition, on the bottom axis is arousal and the left axis is performance. If your arousal level increases, there are specific symptoms that come in. Stress, fatigue, exhaustion, commission errors on testing. If your brain is failing or your arousal level is dropping, you're getting tired, dragged out, you get boredom and drowsiness and omission errors on the testing. And that's with a normal brain. It's performance will change a little bit with arousal, but not an awful lot. What happens if the brain goes into a failure mode? The left side of the brain typically fails into an under-aroused condition. So if you're functioning here and your arousal level drops, your performance level plummets. If your arousal level goes up and you're okay here, your performance goes up. That's why you give ADD your Ritalin, stimulants. Increases your arousal level, the brain wakes up, and they function better. if people are stressed out and they're over-aroused and their brain has failed in over-arousal, the higher you increase their arousal level, the lower the performance goes. So people who are really stressed out, anxious, you give them tranquilizers. The tranquilizer lowers the arousal level and increases their performance. What happens if you get both happening at the same time? And you have this tiny little area, if everything is perfect in your environment, you are at the top of your game and you are on fire. Just a little bit of arousal level change and the world collapses and you can't function. I had a professor come to me. This woman was the dean of a college in a university. Had multiple PhDs. Had done all of her work, she had bipolar disorder, had done all of her work throughout her entire career in the 3 months out of the year that she was functioning well. The rest of the time, she hid under her desk and let her work stand for itself. And she rose to the peak of her career. Then when she hit 52, her 3 good months didn't come. She came to me and she was 57 and she had been non-functional for about 5 years. She had to retire. She couldn't maintain her job. She couldn't do anything. Neurofeedback just broadened these arousal curves right out, and she was back doing her research as professor emeritus, back on top of her game. But now she was on top of her game all the time, not just 3 months out of the year. And so you actually see that more than you might expect.
That definitely applied to me when I first came. I was really trying to understand why, given that there were some times I could function as well as ever, why was it such a small percentage of the time? You know, I felt like it had to be my fault, given that I couldn't maintain it. But it was just like that. Just add a little bit of stress, and I was managing my household, but then add a little bit of stress, all of a sudden, I got to go to bed, shut the door, and shut out the world. Luckily, I could go to a peaceful place if I did that. But, you know, just a little bit of fatigue, and, I got to go take a 2-hour nap. So it was bouncing on the head of a pin, in terms of my physiological arousal.